Alright, so this is probably what Photoshop looks like whenever you first get into it on your computer. Um, it might have a different looking screen over here than my libraries, just because I have all these color palettes and stuff that I've made. But you can go ahead and collapse a bunch of this stuff. I'm just going to show you how to clean up your interface. So I'm going to collapse these icons so I only have one, and in fact I'm just going to move that libraries icon. Notice I can drag and drop it over here, and now it's over here. We can also get rid of some of the things we're not going to be using, so like colors, swatches, gradients, patterns. Let's just double click it and just make that area smaller. We are going to be using the properties and the adjustments tab a lot, so much so that if you have the screen space for it, I'd recommend pulling the adjustments tab out and letting it sort of rest on top of properties. So now you have these two sort of on top of each other. And then I like to make this just a little bit smaller, and here's the layers panel. So Photoshop, if you've never used it before, I have an entire course on that you're welcome to jump into on my YouTube channel. I'll post it in the class. It's probably about 30 videos long. It gives you just a really rough overview of Photoshop. But essentially it works on this layers system. So this is a layer, and your layers might be basically a series of images. They could be blank. They could be they could be shapes. They could be adjustments. There's all kinds of different things. We're going to work with a couple different layer types, but today we're mostly going to be working with what are called adjustment layers. So layers sit on top of each other. The bottommost layer, so whenever I just had that example before, the bottommost layer sits under the others, and the others show through on top. And so whenever we make adjustments, we're going to make adjustment layers on top of our bottommost or our background image layer. Now you're not doing any compositing in this project, right? You're not chopping up images from other things and pulling them in together. None of that kind of manipulation, which we will be able to do in the future, and I'm going to encourage that in the future. We're just going to focus on adjustments for now. So there's this adjustments menu which has a bunch of different options, and it's actually broken up in these three rows for a reason. So this top one, these all have to deal with light, okay? This middle row all has to deal with color, and this bottom row are basically what we might call creative effects, all right? Whenever I click one of those, it's going to add a layer down here, an adjustment layer. Let's start by just clicking the, let's do exposure. So I click exposure, and you'll notice what happens down here is we get a new layer called Exposure 1, and it has that icon that I clicked before. It has this little chain, that's a chain link right there, and it has this white square, okay, and that's called the layer mask. And we're going to get into how to use layer masks a little bit later. But for now, all you need to know is this exposure layer is now affecting the layer below it, or all the layers below it, in fact, which right now there's just one. It's this background image. I can show and hide a layer by clicking the little eyeball next to it, and if I want to prevent changes from being made, I can click the little lock and lock down that layer. So I show and hide, nothing's changing right now because there's no adjustments actually being made. We've just added an adjustment layer, but we haven't actually changed anything. So where do we go to change things after we've added them as adjustment layers? We do that in the Properties pane. So we have a Properties window. If you don't see your Properties window, visit the top of your screen and click Window, and go down and select Properties so that you get that little side panel. So the Properties screen is showing me, okay, I'm modifying the exposure. Here's a preset, and there's a bunch of different presets in here. This is the exposure, and I can pull this slider left and right, the offset, the gamma correction, and then actually three little eyedroppers, one for shadows, one for midtones, and one for highlights. So right now, if I grab this exposure bar and move it, it's going to change the exposure of my scene. And you can hear my cat right now while I'm editing a photo of a different cat. So hopefully you can just ignore that. Sorry. He's pretty talkative. So hang on just a second. So basically, what we're going to do is we're going to make some adjustments to our exposure, and we're going to change what our scene looks like. So if I lower my exposure, right, it's going to become darker. If I raise my exposure, it's going to become brighter. All right, now the reason we're working with this adjustment layer, that's what we call these, is that I can easily remove this at any time. So in 100 years from now, if computers are still around or whatever, I could open up Photoshop and remove this and be back to my original image. We're always going to work what's called non-destructively on our images. So I'm going to select my exposure layer, And I'm actually just going to delete it because I don't really need to change the exposure right now. So I'm going to select it, and I'm going to either click the trash can or I can drag it to the trash can. I'm just going to click it, and it's going to ask me, do I want to delete this? It's actually asking if I can delete the layer mask. Let me click that layer again, hit delete, and now it's gone. All right, so let's add a different adjustment. So that was exposure. Let's add one called levels, which you see right here. And the levels adjustment, we get our trusty friend, the histogram, back. Notice the histogram is just black and white in this case. It's not the full color, what we call the RGB histogram. It's a black and white histogram. And what it's showing me is this is the darkest areas of my photos and the brightest area of my photo. And what I'm going to do is what's called the basic levels adjustment. And this is a thing I do on every photograph. The basic levels adjustment is I take the top little handle here and I move it to the end of the mountain, and I take the bottom handle and I move it to the beginning of the mountain. And let's just look at a before. So this is the before and the after. You can see how much that changes the contrast. That's basically adding a bunch of contrast to my photo. In fact, I might pull this guy down a little bit more so you can see in real time what's happening is that I'm kind of clamping part of my photo. Now this middle button, the middle little guy, is basically our exposure. So as I move it, it's changing the midtones of the photograph, and I like to have this sort of darker, richer image, so I'm going to move it just up a little bit, and it's going to be just a little bit closer to my high end. All right, there we go. So that's the levels adjustment that I've just made. There's other adjustments in here, such as brightness and contrast, which is not particularly useful. Curves, which are very useful, and we'll get into a lot in the future. And whenever I open up curves, in fact, as you can see, it's our friend, the histogram. And curves allow you to modify different parts of your histogram to create some really, pretty lovely effects. I'm going to make this really intense effect, and then I'm going to talk through another reason we use adjustment layers. So I've made this intense effect. Don't worry too much about the curve. We're going to get into it in a lot more detail in the future. Just play around with it and see what you can do. But you'll notice it's really intense, and maybe I like the effect, but I just want it less intense on my image. Well, the other reason we use adjustment layers rather than modifying our image directly in Camera Raw is that we can dynamically change the opacity, or how much that layer affects the layers below it. So right now it's at 100%, and if I click that and lower the opacity, it's going to lower the effect that it has on the layers below. So it's the same effect, I'm just lessening it. I'm just kind of almost like mixing my palette here. I'm just making it a little bit lower. And again, I can always look at before and after as I play with that. All right, so let's try a color adjustment. And we could do hue and saturation. Hue and saturation, hue is the actual color, saturation is the amount of color, and lightness is the brightness of that color. This is also where we could check the colorize box and do some colorized stuff if you really want to. But I think the saturation is pretty great in this. I might want to shift the hue just a little tiny bit up, like literally +2, +3 up, and I'm calling that good. Let's also pick this one, photo filter. So I'll click photo filter, and photo filter is a great option. Let's look at the before and the after, and you can probably just very subtly see it just got a little bit warmer. Photo filters are pieces of glass that you put directly in front of your camera lens that affect your image in different ways. We're going to learn more about them in the future. Right now I'm using a warming filter, and the warming filter is at 25% density, and if I turn that up, it'll become more warm, and if I turn that down, it'll become less warm. You can see that here. So I can move that to get a kind of vintage look. There's also cooling filters, and there's also like red filters and things like that that you can play with. So I'm going to just do kind of a nice, let's do a little bit of a cooling filter, and I'll just turn that density down. So here's the before and the after. It's just sort of correcting some of the greenness that you're seeing in the orange here. So there's other things in here that you could play with. There's like channel mixer, black and white, color balance, and then there's some fun ones down here. So there's things like posterize, which posterize our image, essentially making it like a kind of 90s music video. I'm just going to hit delete on that. These are generally not great, and I wouldn't recommend using them. So we've added these adjustments, and we can change, again, like the opacity, like how much they affect the layers below them. And we're going to get into Thursday how to modify the layer masks, these little white boxes, to really dramatically change how those adjustment layers affect the layer below. But for now, let's say I'm good. I'm going to save my image, and I want to save this first as a PSD. So I'm going to go File, Save, and it's saying you want to save it as a Photoshop document. Yeah, that's fine with me, and I'll give it a useful name and not just this gobbledygook. So I'll call it Yuki. That's the cat's name. And I'll save it as a Photoshop document. Cool, now I can open it, and it's always going to have these layers. Now, if I wanted to send this to a friend, I would want to save this out as a different format. So Photoshop documents have all these layers, they have all this data, they're huge. For example, if I pull that up, that Photoshop document is probably, let's see how big it is. It is 95 megabytes. That is huge, way too big for an email and way too big for a text. Let's go File, Save As, and instead we'll save this out as a JPEG. So we always want to save a Photoshop document so that we have that we can refer to later, but let's save a JPEG version. So a JPEG is the kind of standard network format, and it's flattened, meaning it does not have these layers, so we are destroying some data, but let's just save it. It's going to ask me the quality. The default's fine. I'll say OK. And let's pull that open and see how big that is. So the JPEG version is 8 megabytes. The Photoshop version is 95. Now that's still pretty huge, that 8 megabytes. That's because the image itself is quite large. You can see that as I zoom in. This is 100%. So it's quite a massive image. We can change that in other ways. So that's the basics of Photoshop. I want you to have fun playing with your images, opening up your raw images, flattening out that histogram in Camera Raw, right? Getting that nice bell curve, and then pulling it into Photoshop and adding adjustment layers.